So, ladies and gentlemen, this is one of your sources that you will be able to use to help you with your President Jefferson paragraph, Thomas Jefferson. There is information in here about George Washington as well that may prove helpful, but this resource is being provided as one of the Thomas Jefferson articles. Now, you'll notice this first page, we really don't need this. This is just background information. Now, it will help, obviously, with your citations. So keep that in mind. But beyond using the information for your citation, you really won't need too much from this page. So here we are now at the beginning of the actual article. You can see the heading is Flawed Founders. And then here you can see the title, To What Degree Do the Attitudes of Washington and Jefferson Towards Slavery Diminish Their Achievements? All right, so we know that this article is going to be focusing on Jefferson's attitude towards slavery, right? And again, you may find some useful information in here to support what you have to say about Washington, but what we're going to be focusing on is simply the Jefferson material. Now, thinking about what this title actually means, the whole idea of diminishing means to take away from. Okay, so we should definitely be finding some information in here about how Jefferson's attitude towards slavery took away from some of his achievements, right? Now we can see the source here adapted from To America, and it gives the title there. Again, this might be helpful information in terms of your citation. First full paragraph. Americans in great numbers are rediscovering their founding fathers in such best-selling books as Joseph Ellis' Founding Brothers, David McCullough's John Adams, and my own Undaunted Courage about Lewis and Clark. There are others who believe that some of these men are unworthy of our attention because they owned slaves, Washington, Jefferson, Clark among them, but not Adams. They failed to rise above their time and place, though Washington, but not Jefferson, freed his slaves. But history abounds with ironies. These men, the founding fathers and brothers, established a system of government that, after much struggle and the terrible violence of the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement led by Black Americans, did lead to legal freedom for all Americans and movement toward equality. So we know that our hunt here, we're trying to find some evidence to support this idea, or to help us understand kind of the role of slavery in impacting Jefferson's legacy. But this is really just providing us with background info. So we don't really have too much that we need here from this first paragraph. We're going to go now, and again, it's hard with these long documents and these long resources to figure out what the important and relevant information is, but that's what I'm going to try to walk you through here a little bit. So in the second paragraph, let's begin with Thomas Jefferson, because it is he who wrote the words that inspired subsequent generations to make the heroic sacrifices that transformed the words, all men are created equal, into reality. Now, that said, I know we're going to start here with Thomas Jefferson, and that is just the man that we are looking for information on. Now, we know that not everything in here is going to be relevant for us, but it is going to be our goal to try to find some evidence here to help us. Next paragraph. In 1996, I was a visiting professor at the University of Wisconsin. The history club there asked me to participate in a panel discussion on political correctness in the university. The professor seated next to me taught American political thought. I remarked to her that when I began teaching, I had required students to read 5 or 6 books each semester, but I had cut that back to 3 or 4, or else the students would drop my course. She said she had the same problem, and she had dropped Thomas Jefferson's writings from the required reading list. You are in Madison being paid by the citizens of Wisconsin to teach their children American political thought, and you leave out Tom Jefferson? Yes, she replied. He was a slaveholder. More than half the large audience applauded. Jefferson owned slaves. He did not believe that all were created equal. He was a racist and capable of rising above the thought of his time and place and willing to profit from slave labor. So, here we are, getting right into it. Jefferson owned slaves. He did not believe that all people were created equal. He was a racist and capable of rising above the thought of his time and place, and he was willing to profit from slave labor. All right, so lots of good examples of Jefferson's views on slavery. Few of us entirely escape our times and places. Thomas Jefferson did not achieve greatness in his personal life. Okay, so I'm taking a look here. He had a slave as a mistress, which some of you may already have known. He lied about it. He once tried to bribe a hostile reporter. His war record was not good. He spent much of his life in intellectual pursuits in which he excelled, and not enough in leading his fellow Americans toward great goals by example. So from that line, I can understand, all right, so he was, when we hear intellectual pursuits, we get the idea, and I'm going to make this note out here, that he was really smart. And I'm very sorry that I'm doing this video without a stylus in my hand. So he was really smart, and he spent a lot of time on that, but did not spend a lot of time, it says not enough time leading his fellow Americans toward great goals by example. So he was not a good role model. Jefferson surely knew slavery was wrong, but he didn't have the courage to lead the way towards emancipation. If you hate slavery and the terrible things it did to human beings, it is difficult to regard Jefferson as great. He was a spendthrift, always deeply in debt. He never freed his slaves. Thus, the sting in Dr. Samuel Johnson's mortifying question, how is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty from the drivers of Negroes? And I think this quote by this man, Dr. Samuel Johnson, is a pretty interesting one. And some of you may have wondered this. And for those of us who read the book Chains, this is the whole idea. Like, how can these people be demanding, all these patriots be demanding freedom and liberty when that's not even something that they are willing to give other men and women in their own country? Of course, and meaning slaves. They did not provide that liberty for slaves themselves. Now here we are at the top of the third page, and just keep in mind that we're not going to be using this entire article, so I know it's a long one, but we won't be using all of this. Again, this document goes on to continue talking about President Washington, so we're just going to be focusing on the Jefferson material. But as we continue into this page, you want to keep in mind, our big question that we're trying to answer with our essay and to prove in this body paragraph is, did the ends justify the means? So thinking about Jefferson's accomplishments, did the things he did along the way, and in this case, and what this source is talking about is his belief and use of slaves and slavery, was that justifiable in the sense of what he was able to accomplish as a president overall? So again, that's kind of our mission here. We're on a hunt for evidence. Now, take a look at the first paragraph. Jefferson knew slavery was wrong, and that he was wrong in profiting from the institution. And when it says the institution, it means from slavery. But apparently could see no way to relinquish it, which just means to give it up. Again, I'm very sorry about no stylus. Could see no way to relinquish it in his lifetime. He thought abolition of slavery might be accomplished by the young men of the next generation. Okay, so he was not seeing himself as really, he knew it was wrong and that he was wrong in profiting from it, but he just couldn't see a way to give it up. So he kind of banked on the idea that the next generation of people would do it. They were qualified to bring the American Revolution to its idealistic conclusion because, he said, these young Virginians had sucked in the principles of liberty as if it was their mother's milk. So he thought the next generation could just deal with the problem. He kind of pushed it off. Next paragraph here. Of all the contradictions in Jefferson's contradictory life, none is greater. Okay, so that's a pretty bold statement there. Of all the contradictions in America's history, none surpasses its toleration, first of slavery and then of segregation. So clearly Jefferson was not the only leader, and there have been, it took a very long time for African Americans in our country to be treated the same as whites. But still, in this case, we're focusing on Jefferson here. Jefferson hoped and expected that Virginians of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark's generation would abolish slavery. His writing showed that he had a great mind and a limited character. And by limited character, it means that he was not a good guy, kind of considered like a bad person. Okay, take a look at the next paragraph. Jefferson, like all slaveholders and many other white members of American society, regarded Negroes as inferior, childlike, untrustworthy, and of course as property. I think that's a pretty strong statement here. Those are his views. Jefferson, the genius of politics, could see no way for African Americans to live in society as free people. No way for Americans to live in society as free people. He embraced the worst forms of racism to justify slavery. Okay, and again, I'm going to make a notation here. I mean, this is a pretty significant, if you had to cite some sources here and some evidence around Jefferson's views on slavery, you got a lot of information in this paragraph that you could use. Now, that said, I wouldn't try to come up with two examples or two pieces of evidence from this same paragraph, but you could certainly at least pull one. Next paragraph. In Notes on the State of Virginia, Jefferson describes the institution of slavery as forcing tyranny and depravity on master and slave alike. To be a slaveholder meant that one had to believe that the worst white man was better than the best black man. If you did not believe these things, you could not justify yourself to yourself. So, Jackson could condemn slavery in words, but not in deeds. So, what this line is saying, and what this whole paragraph is showing, is that Jefferson could write that it was bad. So, when he says in words, he means he could write about how bad slavery was, but he couldn't actually act that way, okay? He couldn't truly stand up for what he believed in. At his magnificent estate, Monticello, Jefferson had slaves who were superb artisans, shoemakers, masons, carpenters, and cooks. But like every bigot, meaning everybody who's racist, he never said, after seeing a skilled African craftsman at work or enjoying the fruits of his labor, "Maybe I'm wrong." He ignored the words of his fellow revolutionary John Adams, who said that the revolution would never be complete until the slaves were free. On the next paragraph here. Jefferson left another racial and moral problem for his successors, the treatment of Native Americans. He had no positive idea what to do with or about the Indians. He handed that problem over to his grandchildren and theirs. So this is, obviously here we're talking Native Americans. This doesn't really apply to what our purpose is, which again is to find some information about Jefferson's views on slavery to consider the answer to the question, does the ends justify the means, in terms of what Jefferson accomplished in his presidency versus what he did along the way. Next paragraph. The author of the Declaration of Independence threw up his hands at the question of women's rights. Okay, so that's another issue. It is not as if the subject never came up. Abigail Adams, at one time Jefferson's close friend, raised it. But Jefferson's attitude toward women was at one with that of the white men of his age. And I'm sure you probably know most men at that time didn't value or see women as equals. He wrote about almost everything, but almost never about women. Not about his wife, nor his mother, and certainly not about Sally Hemings. Now, again, this is kind of a paragraph that doesn't really apply. So that's kind of like this one, the Native Americans one, and this women's rights one. Down to the next paragraph. So it is a particular irony to admit that Jefferson was as remarkable a man as America has produced. Spent the evening with Mr. Jefferson, John Quincy Adams wrote in his diary in 1785, whom I love to be with. You can never be an hour in the man's company without something of the marvelous. And even Abigail Adams wrote of him, he is one of the choice mans of the earth. So people, he was definitely still considered a highly respected, again, I'm so sorry about not having a stylus, a highly respected man, despite all of the things that we've just talked about, his views on slavery. Next paragraph. Jefferson was born rich and became well educated. He was a man of principle, except for slaves, Indians, and women. His civic duty was paramount to him, meaning very important. He read deeply and widely, more than any other president of the United States, except possibly Theodore Roosevelt. He wrote well and with more productivity and skill than any other president, except perhaps Theodore Roosevelt. Wherever Jefferson sat was at the head of the table. Those few who got to dine with him around a small table always recalled his charm, wit, insights, queries, explanations, gossip, curiosity, and above all else, his laughter. Okay, so what we've read about in that this paragraph here, and in the beginning of the paragraph at the end of the other page, people really, really liked him. So it's not as if, maybe what you might think of when you think of a stereotypically kind of racist person. It's not like he was some big jerk. People really found him very interesting. He was brilliant. He was a great guy to be around. That background information continues here. Jefferson's range of knowledge was astonishing. Science in general, flora and fauna specifically, geography, fossils, the classics and modern literature, languages, politicians of all types, politics, state by state, county by county, international affairs. He was an intense partisan. He loved music and playing the violin. He wrote countless letters about his philosophy, observations of people and places. In his official correspondence, Jefferson maintained a level of eloquence not since equaled. I've spent much of my professional life studying presidents and generals, reading their letters, examining their orders to subordinates, making an attempt to judge them. None match Jefferson. So I'm just going to boil this down by saying he was one amazing man. So despite everything in terms of his views on slavery and the way that he treated slaves, he was truly an amazing man. Now pay close attention here to this next paragraph. In spite of these rare abilities, Jefferson was not a hero. Okay? His great achievements were words. And we're all familiar with that expression, actions speak louder than words. Except for the Louisiana Purchase, his actions as president fall short. I think this is a pretty significant passage here. But those words, he was the author of the Declaration of Independence. The second paragraph begins with a perfect sentence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Those words, as the historian Samuel Eliot Morison has said, are more revolutionary than anything written by Robespierre, Marx, or Lenin, a continual challenge to ourselves, as well as an inspiration to the oppressed of all the world. Eventually, with Lincoln, who articulated and lived these truths, and slowly afterward, the idea made its progress. So I'm going to just write down the idea. Words, not actions. Okay. Next paragraph. Jefferson was the author of the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, a doctrine that spread throughout the United States. This up here. He is the father of our religious freedom. It is, next to the words of our independence, his greatest gift, save only perhaps our commitment to universal education, which also comes to us via Jefferson. Okay. So he's done a lot for us. He's the father of our religious freedom. He pushed for that to be an important part of our country. And along with our commitment to universal education, meaning the required availability of free public education to everyone in our country. Let's take a look at the next paragraph. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 was based on Jefferson's report of a plan of government for the Western Territory written 3 years earlier. In it, he made sure that when the populations of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan were large enough, these and other territories would come into the Union as fully equal states. They would have the same number of senators and representatives as the original 13. They would elect their own governors and so on. He was the first who had the thought that colonies should be equal to the 13 original members of the Union. No one before him had proposed such a thing. Empires were run by the mother country, with the king appointing the governors. It was Jefferson who decided that we wouldn't do it that way in the United States. The territories would be states. He applied the principles of the Northwest Ordinance to the Louisiana Purchase territories, and by later extension to the West Coast. It was Jefferson who envisioned an empire of liberty that stretched from sea to shining sea. Now, obviously, this whole paragraph here, it's interesting and it may prove helpful to you in another way, but there isn't too much there regarding slavery. So if you're looking for information of slavery, or regarding slavery, this is not where you're going to find it. Now, you can see the next paragraph starts, Washington and Jefferson were both rich Virginia planters, but they were never friends. Washington did not have Jefferson's IQ, and then it continues. So you can see now we're getting into the Washington information, and so that's, again, kind of not our purpose with this source, though you're welcome to continue perusing through it and finding information. Just a few tips about some big ideas that can be helpful to you. Certainly the idea of just generally as you're working on this and trying to pull out important information from these sources, you want to be thinking about just keeping your big idea in mind. What is it that you're looking for? What is it that you're trying to prove? And hopefully before you're even going into these sources, you've got a good sense of that. So if you still have any questions about this particular source and you'd like to sit down or pull anything out together, please feel free to stop by my room, Mrs. Ruth's room, during Panther Time or Period 7, or shoot me an email. In the meantime, best of luck with writing your essay.